How's it going, everybody? My name is Michael Levan. Thank you for joining me in the Global Azure Virtual Summit of 2020. I'm going to be bringing you containerization and orchestration in Azure. We're going to be taking a look at some live demos. And before we can do that, let's just go through 2 or 3 PowerPoint slides about what we'll be presenting. So a little bit about me is I'm an Azure and DevOps trainer at CBT Nuggets. I'm the founder and chief engineer at CloudDev.Engineering LLC. And the primary technologies that I pretty much focus on is PowerShell, Python, Azure DevOps, GitHub Actions CI/CD, Terraform, Kubernetes, and Docker. So the first thing that we'll take a look at is containerization with container instances in Azure. Now think of container instances similar to like if you're running Docker, like you have a Docker container and you're running it locally on your Windows 10 machine or on Mac OS or on a Linux desktop. It's pretty much what it is, except it's just sitting in Azure, right? There's no redundancy. You're just kind of running the application up there like you would locally. You have some hypervisor level security that's provided by Azure, and then you have some options for persistent storage as well for those containers if you don't want them to be completely ephemeral. The next thing that we'll take a look at is ACR, which is a Docker image registry, very similar to, Docker Hub, for example, or maybe if you're storing images in Artifactory, pretty much the same. It's just a place to store your Docker images. The third thing we'll take a look at is orchestration with AKS or Azure Kubernetes Services, which is a managed Kubernetes platform in Azure, meaning you don't touch or really manage the Kubernetes API or the master node itself. You're really just worried about the workers. So with that, let's jump into the demos. Let's take a look at Azure container instances first. So to create an Azure container instance, we'll have to use the container az-cli command. So first we'll type in az-container, followed by what type of switch we want. So it's going to be create. Then we're going to specify a resource group. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to specify a name for our container instance. So I'm just going to call this web server. And then I'm going to specify an image. So the image can be specified either if you want to pull it from Docker Hub, or you want to pull it from a sample, or you want to pull it from a container registry. You can do all of the above. I'm going to just pull in Nginx latest image. Okay, then I'm going to specify the OS type, which is going to be Linux. Now I get to specify what type of resources I want this container instance to have. So I'm going to specify for CPUs, I'm just going to specify 2, and then for memory, it's going to be a small web server. So I'll just give it the max 3.5. And then the cool thing about this is, because remember, we're specifying a web server and we're spinning up an Nginx image, we're going to be able to see this thing publicly if we want to. So let's specify an IP address. And for this IP address, let's go with public. So as this is running, this is going to take a little bit to run. All right, and I went ahead and just paused the video, but you can see here that all of the container instances have been created, which was 1, right? So we can see that the container instance was created. We can see that Nginx was the image that was used. So now let's head over to the Azure portal. Okay, so we're at the Azure portal now. Let's go ahead and just refresh the screen here. So I can see that my container has been created. Let's go ahead and click on that. And I'm going to have a public IP address here. So what I want to do is I'm going to copy this public IP address. Now open up a web browser and take out public. And we can now see that Nginx is running. So if we go back to the container, we can see some information like the subscription ID, what resource group it's in, any memory, CPU, network utilization. We can also see the container logs here, right? So we can see that the image was pulled, it was successfully pulled, the container was started, and then the container was created. So that's how you create a container instance. Now let's take a look at ACR. So we're back at our terminal here and we're ready to create an Azure container registry. So let's go ahead and paste in this code. Before we run it, let's go over it. So the first thing is we're using the ACR AZ command. We're going to be using the create switch. We're specifying the resource group of Azure Global Summit, same thing that we did with the container instance. The name of the ACR, we'll just call it Global Summit, and then the SKU is going to be basic. So let's go ahead and run that. Now, once you run and create the ACR, it's not that simple to just get into it from the command line. You have to actually log into it from the command line itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to type in AZ ACR. We're going to use the login switch. And then for the name, we're going to specify the name of the ACR. So if we scroll up here, we can see that it's called Global Summit. Let's scroll down here. And then let's go ahead and log into it. So once we're logged in, we'll be able to actually push Docker images up to this ACR. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a Docker pull, and we'll go with the theme of Nginx latest. Okay, so what this is going to do is this is going to download the Docker image for the latest Nginx image in Docker Hub. And then once we have the image, we can go ahead and push that image up to ACR. Now, to push it to ACR, we have to tag this image. So if we scroll back up here, the FQDN of sorts, or the login server, is going to be this whole thing. So globalsummit.azurecr.io. So to tag the image, we have to essentially just type docker tag, and then we're going to call the ACR. And then once we call the ACR, we can kind of just give the image a name. So we can just say Nginx v1. So let's go ahead and tag that. Now, as you can see, it's going to require the Docker image itself. So let's go ahead and go up here, and we'll specify Nginx. So it's going to be docker tag Nginx and then the tag name. So once we do that, we can push the Docker image up to ACR. So if we just go here and then we type in docker push, this is going to now prep our Docker image to be pushed up to globalsummit.azurecr.io. And then what's going to happen is we're going to be able to log into ACR from the web portal and see our image. Let's take a look. So we're back in the Azure portal. Let's go ahead and look up container registry. Click on container registry, and now we can see our newly created container registry that we created on the CLI. We can click on that, and then if we go ahead and go down to repositories, we can now see our Nginx repository and our v1 image that we pushed up to ACR. So we pulled the Docker image down, we tagged it, and then we pushed it up, and now it exists in ACR. So the last thing that we're going to see is Azure Kubernetes services, or Kubernetes managed services in Azure. Let's take a look. What we're going to need to do is type in AKS, and we'll go to AKS, and instead of creating the AKS cluster within the CLI, I'm going to create it on the UI because there are a ton of different options and I want everybody to be able to see them visually. So I'm going to click on create Kubernetes service, and then this is going to load up all my options here. So the first thing is you have to pick a resource group. I'm going to pick the Azure Global Summit resource group. Now I need to give my AKS cluster a name. And that name can be anything that I want. I'm just going to call it Global Summit. Okay, I'm going to keep it in East US. Now, one of the important things is, remember, because you're not managing the API or the Kubernetes version, you have to be able to pick and choose which version you want here. Now, these are all the versions that Azure supports. Now, these aren't all of the versions that are available in the world, but these are the versions of Kubernetes or the API that Azure supports. So we'll just keep the default 115.10, and then we'll go ahead and look at our primary nodes. So our nodes are the worker nodes of how many we want spun up. So in this case, it's spinning up, 3 worker nodes. We could easily bump this up to 10, right? Or we could just go to 1. Now in the sizes, this is going to specify what the size of the worker node that we want. Now, as you can see, all of the sizes aren't available, right? So we can see a whole bunch of several different sizes here, but we're not going to see any of the smallest sizes because Kubernetes won't be able to run properly with that. So we'll keep the default size and then we'll go to scale. Now the scale is essentially both the virtual nodes and the VM scale sets. So we have VMSS available, and then we also have these virtual nodes. And these virtual nodes enable you to deploy or burst out containers nodes backed by serverless Azure container instances. So what that means is we can actually have container instances running that are connected to AKS, which is phenomenal. Now, the next thing we can do is click on authentication. We can just generate a new service principal for this unless you have an existing service principal that you would like to utilize. And then now we see our networking. So we have a private cluster networking, or we have the private cluster networking to be disabled. And this essentially means that all the internal IP addresses are used to ensure that the network traffic between the API server and their node pools remain on a private network only. So we don't want that because we don't want to have to manage the network at that Kubernetes level. We want Azure to be able to manage that for us. And then we have some HTTP routing if we want it from a DNS perspective. Any load balancers, this is just going to be the standard load balancer. So let's say you expose a Kubernetes deployment, you can easily have that turn into a load balancer in Azure. And then you have the basic networking configuration and the advanced networking configuration. Typically people choose the basic network configuration because you're using an Azure Kubernetes service managed by Azure, you kind of want to keep it for Azure to manage. Now you can absolutely choose advanced and specify, the actual network within Kubernetes, because the way Kubernetes networking works is you have your own subnet, your own CIDR, everything inside of the AKS cluster. So what this is essentially saying is, okay, if you want to manage this or you want to pick the ranges, go for it. If not, Azure will do it for you. So the next thing we'll see is the monitoring, right? So we can either enable container monitoring or we don't have to, which you definitely should, especially if you're using the service. Enable it and you can take a look at all of your containers in in Application Insights if you'd like, and the logs will be available and the monitoring will be available from AKS itself. So the next thing is you can just set up your log analytics workspace, and then we'll click next. Any tags if you want to. So for instance, you can specify your environment, and if this is a development environment, and then next you can go ahead and review and create this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause while this is creating, because this could take, I've seen it take like up to 17 minutes. So let's let this thing run and then we'll see it when it comes up. Our resource has been created and let's go ahead and take a look. Okay, so here's our AKS cluster. We can specify here the node pools. We can look at upgrading if we want to. So for example, we can bump up to 1.16.7 on the cluster itself. We can see any networking. If we want to do some CI/CD deployments, we can absolutely do that right from AKS. And here's our AKS cluster. Thank you so much for watching this. I hope that you liked the container and orchestration section, and I look forward to seeing you next year.